quick word before we dive in. When you read a title like I Just Wanted a Granola Bar, and Now I'm the Adopted Brother of Two Alien Princesses, your brain probably does one of two things. Either you laugh because it sounds like the setup to a joke, or some part of you leans in, because you know exactly what kind of night turns a granola bar run into the last normal thing that ever happens to a person. Which one is it going to be tonight? Stick around. You're going to want to see how far this goes. Jake Merrow had worked the night shift at the Pine Hollow gas station for 3 years, and in that time, he had learned exactly one truth about the universe. Nothing good ever happened after midnight in a town this small. Cars rolled through every hour or so, mostly truckers passing on their way to somewhere better, and Jake rang them up, made small talk about the weather, and watched the clock crawl towards 6 a.m., like it owed him money. He was 27 years old, and if you asked him what he had to show for it, he wouldn't have had much of an answer. His mother had passed when he was 19. His father had left long before that, back when Jake was still young enough to believe fathers didn't do that kind of thing. No siblings, a handful of friends who'd scattered to cities with better jobs and better lives, the kind of friends who texted we should catch up and meant it, right up until they didn't. Jake had stayed in Pine Hollow because someone had to keep the lights on at the gas station, and because leaving had always felt like something other people got to do. It was a Tuesday night in October, the kind of night where the cold had just started biting through jackets, and Jake was thinking about nothing in particular except the growl in his stomach. He hadn't eaten since noon. He walked down aisle 3, past the motor oil and the energy drinks, and grabbed a granola bar off the rack, the cheap kind, oats and honey. The same one he always got because it was the only thing in the store that didn't taste like cardboard trying too hard. He was tearing open the wrapper when the sky turned white. It wasn't lightning. Lightning didn't last 3 full seconds, and it didn't come with a sound like the world clearing its throat. Jake dropped the granola bar and grabbed the counter as the windows rattled in their frames, every bottle on every shelf behind him shivering with a low hum that seemed to come from inside his own teeth. Outside, past the pumps, past the tree line that marked the edge of Miller's Woods, something had lit the clouds up orange from beneath, like the forest itself had swallowed a piece of the sun. For a solid 10 seconds, Jake didn't move. He stood there with his hand on the counter, half convinced he was about to see a helicopter crash, or a gas line rupture, or one of the dozen boring, terrible explanations his mind kept reaching for because they were easier to believe than the alternative. Then the second sound came, a long, tearing shriek of metal, low and mechanical. Nothing like an engine or an explosion he'd ever heard, and something in Jake's chest told him this wasn't boring at all. Here's the part where I'd love to tell you Jake did the smart thing and called 911 and stayed behind the counter. He didn't. And if you're anything like me, you already know why. Some things pull you toward them whether you want to go or not. He grabbed the only 2 things within reach that felt like they might matter: a heavy metal flashlight from under the register, and, without really thinking about it, the tire iron leaning against the wall by the door, left there from when he'd helped a stranded driver change a flat back in August and never gave it back to the shelf. He locked the front door behind him, more out of habit than logic, and walked toward the tree line. The cold hit him first, sharper than it had been 10 minutes ago, like the temperature itself had dropped in sympathy with whatever had just happened. The orange glow was fading now, replaced by a faint pulsing blue light coming from somewhere deep in the woods, maybe 200 yards past the fence line that marked the edge of the gas station's property. Jake followed a deer trail he half remembered from years of walking it as a teenager. Flashlight beam bouncing off tree trunks, tire iron gripped tight enough that his knuckles ached. He found the crash before he found anything else, a long gouge torn through the earth, 20 feet wide. Trees snapped clean in half like they were made of drinking straws, the smell of ozone and something metallic hanging thick in the air. And at the end of the gouge, half buried in torn soil and smoking gently, sat something that made every rational thought in Jake's head simply stop working. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter. It was smooth, curved, plated in a material that shimmered faintly blue even without direct light hitting it, like something had built a teardrop out of hammered starlight. A section of the hull had peeled back like a can opener had gone through it, and smoke curled lazily out of the gap. Jake should have run. He knew that, even as he was walking closer instead. "Hello?" His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. Is anyone hurt in there?" The answer wasn't words. It was a groan, low and pained, distinctly not human, coming from inside the wreck. Jake's grip on the tire iron tightened, but his feet kept moving anyway, some instinct older than fear pulling him toward the sound of someone in pain. He climbed through the torn hull opening and nearly dropped the flashlight. Inside, slumped against a bank of unfamiliar controls that pulsed with dying light, was a woman, if woman was even the right word, with skin the pale gray blue of riverstone and hair so dark it looked like it drank the flashlight beam rather than reflecting it. She wore armor, cracked down one side, and a long gash across her ribs that wept something closer to violet than red. Her eyes opened when the light hit her, and even half-conscious, even bleeding, there was a sharpness in them that told Jake instantly this was not someone who scared easily. Whatever had put her in this state had been serious. Behind her, wedged into a recessed compartment that had clearly been built for exactly this purpose, were two small figures. Girls' children, no older than 7 or 8 by the look of them, with the same pale gray-blue skin, huddled together with their arms locked around each other so tight their knuckles had gone nearly white. One of them had a faint silver mark along her jaw, like a birthmark that caught the light strangely. The other's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, though she'd clearly been trying to stay quiet. "Please," the woman said, and her English was accented but clear, each word costing her visible effort. "Please, take them away from here." Before she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I think it's the whole story right there. A stranger, bleeding out in a wrecked ship on a planet that isn't even hers, and her very first thought isn't about herself. It's take them. That's the kind of person you write 100 books about." "Before what?" Jake asked, even as some deep, animal part of his brain was already answering the question for him. The woman's eyes flicked toward the torn opening behind him, toward the woods, toward the darkness beyond the dying blue light of the ship's systems. "Hunters," she managed. "They followed us through the breach. They will have tracked the wreck signature already. Minutes, maybe less." Jake didn't understand half of what she'd said, but he understood hunters, and he understood minutes, and something about the way she said it made the hair on his arms stand up straight. He looked at the two girls, who were now looking at him, really looking, with the particular kind of wide-eyed, desperate hope that only children in danger seem to have. Like they'd already decided he was the answer to a question they hadn't asked yet. "What's your name?" Jake asked the woman quietly, kneeling down beside her. "Iridia," she said, "captain of the Royal Guard of House Serenoth. These are the twin heirs Ren and Kessa. Please, I am asking you as a soldier who has failed her duty tonight, get them somewhere safe." Jake had never been asked to protect anyone in his life. He'd never so much as been in a real fight, not one that mattered, not one where the stakes were higher than a bruised ego in a high school parking lot. He was a gas station clerk who ate the same granola bar every night and went home to an apartment that never felt quite like a home. He was not, by any measure that made sense to him, the kind of person who got handed 2 frightened alien children and told to keep them alive. But there was something about the way Ren, the one with the silver mark along her jaw, reached out and grabbed his sleeve with both small hands, not letting go, that made the decision for him before his brain had finished catching up. "Okay," Jake said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Okay, I've got you. Both of you." He didn't get the chance to ask what hunters meant in any more detail, because that was the exact moment the first shot hit the outer hull, and the whole wreck lit up white again, not the sky this time, but a beam of pure white hot light that punched clean through the metal 3 feet from where they were crouched, close enough that Jake felt the heat of it against his cheek. Iridia's whole body went rigid despite her wounds. "They're here," she said. "Go. Now there is a supply satchel beneath the pilot's seat. Take it. Whatever happens to me, get them out." "I'm not leaving you," Jake said, already reaching under the seat for the satchel, because apparently some part of him had already accepted that this was happening, that this was his life now, at least for the next several minutes. "You have no weapon that will matter against them," Iridia said, and for the first time, something like fear cracked through her composure. "You have children and a piece of metal from a farming vehicle. It's a tire iron," Jake said, mostly to himself, and grabbed Ren's hand in his free one while gesturing for Kessa to take his other arm. "And I've got a gas station full of stuff that burns, sprays, and hurts like hell, about 200 yards that way. Can you walk?" Iridia forced herself upright, teeth gritted hard enough that Jake heard it, one hand pressed to the wound at her ribs. "I can walk," she said. "I can also still fight." Another beam of light tore through the hull, closer this time and outside in the trees. Jake heard something moving, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through underbrush, more than one set, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once worried about losing. "Then let's move," Jake said, and pulled both girls toward the opening in the hull, Iridia limping close behind, and stepped back out into the cold October night that had, somewhere in the last 15 minutes, stopped being his night at all. They ran. The woods that Jake had walked 1,000 times as a bored teenager looked entirely different at a dead sprint with 2 terrified children in tow and something inhuman closing in behind him. Branches he knew by heart now seemed to reach for his face out of nowhere. The deer trail that had felt so familiar an hour ago now felt like a maze designed specifically to slow him down. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder, and now there was a sound underneath them too, a low clicking, rhythmic and patient, like something counting down. Kessa stumbled on a root and nearly went down. Jake caught her under the arm without breaking stride, hauling her back up, and she looked at him with an expression that broke something open in his chest, not just fear, but a desperate kind of trust, the kind that says, "You are the only thing standing between me and whatever is happening right now." "We're okay," Jake told her, even though he had no idea if that was true. "We're okay. Almost there." The gas station's lights came into view through the trees, warm and yellow and impossibly ordinary against everything that had just happened, and Jake felt a flicker of something like hope. If he could get them inside, lock the doors, get to the phone. A-shape stepped out from behind a tree 20 feet ahead of them, blocking the path to the fence line. And every hopeful thought in Jake's head went silent at once. It stood taller than any man Jake had ever seen, easily 7 feet. Its body wrapped in dark plating that seemed to drink the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its head was narrow, almost insectile, with 3 sets of eyes arranged in a vertical line that all swiveled toward them at once, glowing a faint, hungry amber. In one clawed hand it carried a weapon that hummed with the same white light that had torn through the ship's hull, aimed now, without hesitation, directly at the 2 girls behind him. Jake didn't have a plan. He didn't have training, or a weapon that made any sense against something built like a nightmare-given armor. What he had was a tire iron, a flashlight, 2 children who had grabbed onto him like he was the only solid thing left in their world, and a rising, burning refusal to let either of those girls take one more step backward. He raised the tire iron, planted his feet, and for the first time in his entire quiet, unremarkable life, Jake Marrow stopped being afraid of what came next. Jake swung the tire iron before he'd even fully decided to. It connected with the creature's forearm just as the weapon fired, and the beam that should have taken Ren and Kessa square in the chest instead tore a smoking gash through the tree line 6 feet to their left, close enough that Jake felt the heat wash over the side of his face like an oven door thrown open. The creature let out a sound that was somewhere between a screech and a growl, more surprised than hurt, and staggered back a single step. That single step was all Jake needed. "Run for the fence," he shouted at the girls, shoving them sideways into the tree line instead of forward, away from the creature's line of sight. "Iridia, get them there. You will die." Iridia snapped, but she was already moving, pulling both girls with her good arm, glancing back at Jake with an expression he didn't have time to read. The creature recovered faster than anything that size should have been able to move, and Jake barely got the tire iron up in time to deflect a claw that would have opened his shoulder to the bone. The impact rattled up his arm hard enough that his fingers went numb for a second, and he stumbled back against a tree, heart slamming so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Here's the thing nobody tells you about fear, real fear. The kind where something might actually kill you in the next 5 seconds. It doesn't feel like the movies. It doesn't slow down time and hand you a clever plan. It just narrows everything down to one single, simple question. What do I do with my hands right now? And Jake's hands, in that moment, found the road flare clipped to his belt from his last shift restocking the emergency aisle. He cracked it against his palm without thinking, and the flare hissed to violent, blinding red life, and he shoved it directly into the vertical row of amber eyes. The creature reared back with a shriek loud enough to send birds scattering out of the canopy above them, both clawed hands coming up to shield its face, and Jake didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran, following the sound of Iridia's ragged breathing and the girl's footsteps through the underbrush. flare still burning in his fist like a torch, casting long red shadows that danced across the trees around him. He caught up to them at the fence line, where Iridia had gotten both girls over and was leaning against a post, one arm wrapped tight around her ribs, breathing hard enough that Jake could hear the wetness in it. That sound scared him more than the creature had. "Inside," Jake said, boosting Kessa over the fence when her small hands couldn't quite manage the top rail. Everyone inside. Now, he got the four of them through the gas station's front door and through the deadbolt, then grabbed the metal display rack from beside the register and dragged it in front of the glass, for whatever good that would do against something that could tear through a spacecraft hull. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their same tired hum they always did, and for one strange, suspended second, Jake stood in the middle of his ordinary workplace with two alien children and a bleeding alien soldier, and thought, distantly, that this was the single strangest sentence his brain had ever had to process about his own life. "Sit," he told Iridia, pulling a folding stool out from behind the counter. "You're bleeding through your armor." "I am aware," Iridia said, but she sat, jaw tight, and Jake grabbed the first aid kit from under the register, the one that had, until tonight, only ever been used for the occasional customer who cut a finger on a beer bottle. He knelt in front of her and peeled back the cracked plating at her side as gently as he could manage with hands that were still shaking from adrenaline. The wound underneath was deep, angry, weeping that same violet color he'd seen back in the wreck. He had no idea if human bandages would even work on whatever she was made of, but he pressed gauze against it anyway, because doing something felt infinitely better than doing nothing. "Why is it violet?" he asked, mostly to keep his voice steady, mostly to keep himself from thinking about the amber-eyed thing still somewhere out there in the dark. "Copper base instead of iron," Iridia said, wincing as he tightened the wrap. "It is a very long conversation for a very short amount of time we may not have." Ren and Kessa had climbed up onto the little plastic chairs by the coffee station, still holding hands, still watching Jake with those wide, hopeful eyes that he was starting to understand he would do almost anything to keep looking hopeful instead of terrified. He caught Ren's gaze and managed something close to a reassuring smile. "You two okay?" he asked. Kessa nodded, small and quick. Ren, the braver of the two by a visible margin, spoke up in accented but clear English of her own. "You hit it with fire," she said, something almost like awe in her voice. "The stick that made fire. Is that a human weapon?" "It's a road flare," Jake said. "It's mostly for when cars break down on the highway at night." "It worked," Ren said, like that settled the matter entirely, and despite everything, despite the very real possibility that something with 3 sets of eyes was still hunting them through the dark, Jake felt a small, stupid laugh escape him. "I think that's the moment I like best in this whole story, if I'm honest. Not the fight, the laugh. Because that's usually how it works, isn't it? You survive the worst 5 minutes of your life, and right afterward some 7-year-old says something so plain and matter-of-fact that it cracks the tension wide open, and you remember you're still a person, not just a body running on fear. How many more of them are out there?" Jake asked Iridia, once the bandage was as tight as he could get it. "I do not know," she admitted. "The hunters travel in cells of 3, sometimes 4. If one engaged you directly, the others are likely circling to cut off retreat rather than converging all at once. They are patient, that is what makes them dangerous. Impatience I could use against them." "And who sent them?" Jake asked. "Back at the ship, you said House Serenoth?" Iridia's expression tightened, and for a moment, the exhaustion and pain in her face gave way to something colder grief, and underneath it, a controlled, banked fury that told Jake this wasn't the first time she'd had to explain this. 3 nights ago, she said, Lord Threxus Malorn staged what he called a correction of leadership within the Serenoth court. He murdered the girls' parents in their sleep and declared the throne vacant, pending a suitable heir being found among his own bloodline. The only obstacle to a clean transition was 2 children who were, by the old laws, still first in line no matter what he declared. I got them onto an escape shuttle 11 minutes before his forces reached the royal quarters. We have been running since. Jake looked at Ren and Kessa, who had gone very quiet, very still, in the way children go quiet when adults are discussing something they understand far better than anyone wants to admit. "Your parents," Jake said softly to both of them. "I'm so sorry." Ren's chin lifted, small and fierce. Iridia says we don't get to be sad yet, she said. She says sad comes later, when we're safe. Jake glanced at Iridia, and something passed between them, not quite an apology, not quite gratitude, but something adjacent to both, and he found himself thinking, absurdly, that even half dead and bleeding on a folding stool in a gas station at 1 a.m, there was something about the steadiness in her that he hadn't expected to notice, and definitely hadn't expected to like noticing. We need a real plan, Jake said, standing, forcing his brain back onto the actual problem. This place has a landline in the back office. I can call no authorities, Iridia said sharply. Malorn's reach extends further than you understand. He will have people monitoring frequencies, watching for any signal that traces back to a landing site. Any call you make becomes a beacon. Then what do? Just wait here for them to find the building? We move again before dawn, Iridia said. Somewhere with distance and cover. The hunters' tracking systems degrade with time and terrain. Every hour that passes without a direct sensor lock makes us harder to find. If we can survive until sunrise and put real distance behind us, we have a chance to disappear long enough for me to reach a contact who can get word to the Consortium Oversight Council. They still recognize the girls as rightful heirs. If Malorn's coup becomes known to them before he consolidates power, he loses everything. Jake ran a hand through his hair, feeling the full, absurd weight of the night pressing down on him all at once. The crash, the creature. The blood on his hands that wasn't his. The 2 orphaned children who had, somewhere in the last hour, started looking at him the way you'd look at someone you'd already decided to trust with your life. Okay, he said. Okay, there's an old hunting cabin about 4 miles east up past the ridge. Belonged to my mom's cousin. Nobody's used it in years, but the roof's solid and there's a wood stove. It's off any main road. Nobody would think to look there unless they already knew Pine Hollow existed. That will do, Iridia said, pushing herself up off the stool, only barely masking the effort it cost her. We should not remain in one structure for long. Buildings become traps as easily as they become shelter. Jake grabbed what he could as they prepared to move again. The first aid kit. A case of water bottles. A box of the same granola bars he'd been about to eat when this whole night detonated around him. A flashlight. And, after a moment's hesitation, the shotgun his boss kept locked in the back office for exactly the kind of emergency this technically qualified as, even if his boss had certainly never imagined anything like this when he'd bought it. He knelt down in front of Ren and Kessa one more time before they left, and something in him, some instinct he didn't fully understand yet, would maybe never fully understand, made him say the thing he said next. Listen to me, Jake said, quiet, steady, looking between the two of them. Whatever happens out there tonight, whatever we run into, I'm not leaving either one of you. Not for anything. You understand? Ren nodded immediately, fiercely. Kessa's lower lip trembled, but she nodded too, and reached out to take Jake's hand again, the same way she had back in the wreck, like it was simply the natural place for her hand to be now. They slipped out the back door of the gas station into the cold, and Jake locked it behind them out of pure habit, knowing full well it would stop nothing that mattered, and led the small, strange, unlikely group of them up the ridge trail toward the cabin, moving fast and low through the trees, every snapped twig behind them sending his pulse spiking all over again. They made it almost 3 miles before the second hunter found them. It came without warning, dropping down out of the canopy directly onto the trail ahead of them, and this one moved differently than the first, faster, lower to the ground. Its plating a deep matte black that made it nearly invisible against the shadows until it was already too close. Iridia shoved both girls behind a fallen log and drew a short blade from her belt that Jake hadn't even known she'd been carrying, blood already soaking through the bandage at her side from the sudden movement. Take them further up the ridge, she said to Jake, voice tight with pain and purpose. I will hold here. No, Jake said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in his life. We already tried the split-up plan once tonight. It almost got us killed. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. Iridia looked at him for one long second, surprise, frustration, and something warmer underneath both of those, all at once, and then the creature lunged, and there wasn't time for anything except the fight. Jake swung the tire iron in one hand and thumbed a fresh road flare to life in the other, and Iridia moved with the fluid, brutal efficiency of someone who had trained her whole life for exactly this kind of night. Even wounded, even exhausted, even outnumbered on an alien world she'd never asked to crash land on. Between the two of them, a gas station clerk who'd never thrown a real punch in his life, and a captain of a royal guard that no longer had a throne to guard, they drove the creature back, step by brutal step, sparks and red flare light, and the ringing clang of metal on plating lighting up the dark forest around two terrified children who watched, wide-eyed, from behind a fallen log, and understood, in the way children sometimes understand things faster than adults do, that whatever this stranger with the tire iron was to them now, he had already decided he was family. The second hunter went down hard. Finally, when Jake got the tire iron into the gap beneath its jaw plating, and Iridia drove her blade through the same opening a half-second later, and the creature folded sideways into the underbrush and didn't move again. Jake stood there for a second, chest heaving, hands slick with something that wasn't his blood, and felt the strangest wave of nausea and relief crash over him at the same time. "Move," Iridia said, before he'd even fully caught his breath, one hand pressed hard against her side. "There may be a third. We do not have the luxury of standing still." They pushed on up the ridge in the dark, Ren and Kessa flanking Jake close enough that he could feel them shaking, and somewhere around the 2-mile mark, the sky behind them started turning the faint gray of early dawn instead of the deep black of true night. Jake had never in his life been so grateful to see a sunrise. The cabin, when they finally reached it, looked exactly the way Jake remembered it from childhood summer squad, weathered, half swallowed by the tree line. A single window facing the trail with glass so old it warped the morning light. He forced the door with his shoulder, the lock long since rusted past usefulness, and got all 4 of them inside before collapsing against the doorframe, letting his legs finally admit how badly they'd been shaking the entire way up. Iridia lowered herself onto the cabin's single cot with a controlled wince, and Jake got the wood stove lit with hands that still hadn't fully stopped trembling, more out of the need to do something with them than any real cold. Ren and Kessa curled up together on a folded blanket near the stove, and within minutes, exhaustion finally caught up to both of them, and they really slept, for the first time since their world had ended 3 nights earlier. Jake sat across from Iridia in the flickering orange light, watching her breathe, watching the tension slowly start to leave her shoulders now that there was a door and 4 walls and no immediate threat of teeth or claws or white-hot beams of light. I think this is usually the part of the story people skip past to get to the next fight scene. But I don't want to skip it, because I think this quiet hour in that cabin is where the whole thing actually happened, not the fighting, the choosing. 2 strangers from different corners of existence, sitting in the dark, deciding they were in this together now, whether either of them had planned on it or not. "You should be dead," Iridia said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice quieter than it had been all night. A civilian, unarmed by any real measure, standing against Malorn's hunters twice in one night. By every reasonable expectation, you should not have survived either encounter. "Yeah, well," Jake said, managing a tired half-smile. "Nobody told me that before I did it." "That is precisely my point," Iridia said. And there was something almost bewildered in her voice, like she was turning the fact over and still couldn't quite make it fit anywhere familiar. "Your species does not train for this. You have no soldier's instinct, no formal combat discipline. And yet you have thrown yourself, twice, between my charges and certain death, without a single moment's hesitation." Jake looked over at Ren and Kessa, asleep by the stove, Kessa's small hand still loosely tangled in her sister's sleeve even in sleep. "I don't really know how to explain it," he said honestly. I looked at them, and I couldn't do anything except what I did. It wasn't really a decision, it just happened." Iridia was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the firelight in a way that made something warm and unfamiliar stir low in Jake's chest, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time, mostly because there hadn't been anyone worth feeling it for. "On my world," she said eventually, "there is an old rite, older than the current royal houses, older even than the consortium's founding charters. When someone outside a house risks everything, truly everything, with nothing to gain and no obligation compelling them to protect a child of that house, the child's remaining family may name that person kin. Not by blood, by choice. It is rarely invoked anymore. Most consider it a relic. And the girls," Jake said slowly, "they're the only family left. Which means the choice, if it is to be made, would fall to them," Iridia said. "Not to me." though I confess I would not object to it. Something in the way she said that last part made Jake's pulse do something entirely unrelated to fear, and for the first time all night, the silence between them wasn't tense at all. They rested in shifts through the following day, and by the second evening, Iridia's contact, a quiet, careful transmission routed through an old signal relay she'd hidden in the cabin's rafters before they'd even properly settled in, finally answered. What followed was 2 more days of careful, exhausting movement, a rendezvous point in an abandoned rail yard 40 miles east, a battered supply shuttle disguised well enough to pass as scrap on any casual scan, and a consortium oversight officer named Halvin Roscoe, gruff and skeptical until he laid eyes on the twin heirs and the signet marks at the base of their necks that no forger could replicate. The evidence Iridia carried logged sensor data from the night of the coup, recovered from the escape shuttle's black box. Showing Malorn's own forces breaching the royal quarters was enough. It didn't end things quietly. Nothing about a stolen throne ever does. But it was enough to freeze Malorn's claim. Enough to bring the full weight of consortium law down on a man who had believed, with the arrogance of someone who has never once been told no, that murdering 2 sleeping monarchs and chasing down their children would go unquestioned simply because he moved fast enough. It took 3 more months and 2 more attempts on the girls' lives that Jake would carry as scars for the rest of his own life before Malorn was finally cornered, stripped of his claim by unanimous council vote, and taken into custody to answer for what he'd done. Jake wasn't there for that final reckoning. He'd asked, once, whether he should be. Iridia had told him, gently, that some doors were better closed by the people who'd opened them, and that his part in this story had already been the part that mattered most. By the time the dust settled, Jake Marrow was no longer the night shift clerk at a gas station nobody outside Pine Hollow had ever heard of. He hadn't planned on any of what came next, not the formal ceremony held quietly on a neutral station somewhere between worlds. Not the strange, humbling weight of Ren and Kessa standing in front of him, hand in hand, asking with a solemnity far beyond their years whether he would accept the old right and become, in every way their law recognized, their brother. He'd said yes before either girl had finished the question. I want to sit on that word for a second, brother, because I think it's easy, in stories like this, to expect some grand romantic gesture to be the whole point. But sometimes the biggest thing a person can become for someone else isn't a lover or a hero. Sometimes it's just the one person a scared kid knows, with absolute certainty, will always come back for them. That's not a small thing. That might be the biggest thing there is. The romance, when it came slower and quieter and entirely on its own terms. It wasn't a single dramatic moment so much as 100 small ones stacked on top of each other, Iridia teaching him, patiently, how to hold a blade properly instead of a tire iron, both of them laughing more than either expected at how badly he took to it at first. Long nights on the new estate Ren and Kessa had been granted as a place of quiet exile turned sanctuary, where Jake and Iridia found themselves, more evenings than not, sitting outside long after the girls had gone to sleep, talking about nothing and everything. About Earth and about a homeworld she couldn't yet safely return to, about the strange, improbable thread that had pulled a gas station clerk and a captain of a fallen house into the same impossible night. It was nearly a year later, on a quiet evening on the sanctuary estate, with Ren and Kessa chasing each other across the garden in a game that involved entirely too much shouting and at least one stolen practice sword, that Iridia finally took Jake's hand in the fading light and asked him, plainly, without any of the formality the old rites usually demanded, whether he intended to stay. I already did stay, Jake told her. The night I picked up that tire iron. I just didn't know yet how long forever was going to end up being. Iridia's answering smile was the kind Jake had learned over the better part of a year was rare and entirely worth waiting for. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that blended a consortium rite Jake barely understood with a small human one that Iridia had insisted on learning properly, down to the vows, because she said if she was going to bind herself to an Earthman, she intended to do it in his language as well as her own. Ren stood at Jake's side. Kessa stood at Iridia's. Neither girl would have accepted standing anywhere else. Life on the estate never became simple. Exactly, Jake still carried the scar along his forearm from that second hunter, still woke some nights with his heart pounding from dreams about amber eyes in the dark, Still had days where the sheer scale of everything that had changed hit him sideways and left him quietly stunned in a doorway for a minute before he shook it off. But it became, in every way that mattered, home. Ren grew fierce and clever, training under Iridia's patient instruction until she could hold her own against guards twice her size. Kessa grew gentle and sharp-eyed in her own different way, less interested in blades and more in the old star charts Iridia kept, tracing routes between worlds Jake still couldn't fully picture. And some evenings, when the work of the day was done and the girls were finally, blessedly asleep, Jake would stand out on the same balcony where he and Iridia had first admitted, months ago, that neither of them wanted this to end, and he'd think about a Tuesday night that started with nothing more complicated than a growling stomach and a cheap granola bar, and somehow ended with an entire life he never could have written for himself in 1,000 tries. He still kept a box of those same granola bars in the kitchen. Nobody ever asked him why. He never really explained it. Some things you just keep, quietly, because they remind you where the whole story actually started. So here's where I land on it. After everything, I think the reason this kind of story hits as hard as it does isn't really the aliens, or the fighting, or even the crown at the center of it. I think it's the reminder that you don't need a title, or training, or a plan to become the most important person in someone else's life. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to let go of a hand that's holding onto yours. Jake Marrow didn't set out to become anyone's brother that night. He just decided, in the space of about 10 seconds, that he wasn't going to be the kind of person who walked away. And somehow, that turned out to be exactly enough. If this one kept you here till the very end, that's honestly the best compliment a story like this can get, and I'd love it if you stuck around for more of them. Drop a like if Jake earned it. Share it with someone who needs a good ordinary guy becomes extraordinary story in their feed. And if you want more nights like this one, go ahead and subscribe to HFY Soundscape so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for staying till the end. See you in the next story.